For the record, I don't listen to this music at home. It's just to set a mood. I said jazz. Jazz was born out of the First World War. It's actually a direct result of the First World War. It's the first popular music that's completely discordant and made up because everything got broken in the First World War. All the promises, all of the things that were supposed to happen, none of them happened. Jazz is literally one of the first things that came out of that. So I was thinking jazz, but jazz sometimes can be like, I know a little too much. I don't know. We'll see. We got a whole night ahead of us. We could mix it up. How many times do you want to hear It's a Long Road to Tipperary? I mean, it's a good song. Anyone who's seen the Charlie Brown Halloween special, which of course everyone has at least once, where Snoopy is the World War I fighter ace, and he goes in and Linus plays the song on the piano and he dances to it. That's a long way to Tipperary. And then he cries during the Marseillaise. That's the French national anthem. And then he goes outside. And then, these are the types of things that you pick up on when you obsess over stuff like this. You're like, oh, that's a long way to Tipperary. I love that song. Is this thing on? Doesn't seem like it's on. It's green light. I'm speaking somewhere, but not here. It's broadcasting me in the street, isn't it? It's a fabulous idea. We on? We in? We're good? All right. All right. That's it. No more dancing around. Good evening, everyone. I am Ryan Weston, the author of P is for Pickelhaube, a historical fiction novel/thriller. And we are here to talk about the Great War tonight. Before we get started, all of you pretty much already know, but Mr. Oliver Bully is here from Sturdy Shelter Brewing. Anybody gets the itch for liquid refreshment, that's the guy. We have a beautiful display of baked goods over here from New Moon Vegan Bakery, just if you get hungry. And a disclaimer before we really get off the ground. 6-foot tables covered in weapons. There are no firearms here. There's no live ammunition of any sort, no live ordnance of any kind. So if that was something in the back of your mind. That being said, there's still 2 6-foot tables covered in weapons right in front of you. So they are still very dangerous for what they are. If you're going to and from, please be mindful. If there's anything anyone wants to see up close or has questions about later, I'd be more than glad. But don't come up because we don't need tetanus shots and stuff. So the Great War is a really broad topic to try to talk about in a given space. I want to specifically hone in on what makes the Great War, in my opinion, so fascinating. Now, since the dawn of time, technology has always driven conflict. Individuals, towns, city-states, groups, clans, armies, nation-states, empires have always sought to overcome and take over other societies with the aid of technology, and vice versa. Stone has bested wood, bronze bested stone, iron, bronze, steel, iron, etc., ad infinitum. And the First World War is not unique in a sense that it did experience an advancement of technology, but what does make it unique, in my opinion, is that during a relatively short duration, 4 years, which is about the time that all of us were in high school, not you yet, we see such an incredible leap in technology straight from the pages of science fiction, but we also paradoxically see a regression of technology. And we see a reemergence of weapon systems and accoutrements that had disappeared from the fields of battle in Europe, in some cases hundreds of years. And it's that juxtaposition that I feel makes this conflict unique. Now, in 1914, as war was declared, the armies of Europe headed off basically on foot. They walked towards the frontiers or rode bicycles, rode horses, of course, and if you're lucky, rode in a train. The internal combustion engine in 1914 was in its infancy for the most part. There was no real powered machinery that was reliable enough, powerful enough to move groups of men and material at any great distance with any guarantee of making it there. So the armies of Europe walked. And with that limitation of the internal combustion engine, Powered flight was absolutely in its infancy in 1914. Aircraft were little better than a dangerous powered kite that was as dangerous to the operator as it was to anyone around it and the ground crews. The concept of a warplane simply did not exist in 1914. An airplane barely created enough power to get off the ground without weapon systems and so forth. Your strongest aircraft in 1914 was a dirigible, lighter than aircraft, the Graf von Zeppelin pattern airship, but you were still limited by the internal combustion engine because the airship needs to be moved by engines. And so we're really limited with ground transportation, air transportation. As far as the individuals themselves who walked off to war, they walked right out of the pages of history. The armies of Europe were attired in tight wool uniforms that were designed by the webbings and the accoutrement that was strapped to you to fight upright, as if it were still the Napoleonic era. The armies of France, for instance, marched off to war with bright crimson red pants with stripes down the side, and dark blue long coats tied behind their backs, and a soft wool cap called a kepi, which was essentially identical to the headgear that the Union and Confederate soldiers were wearing during our Civil War in the 1860s. From experience, I can tell you it offers zero protection from sun, wind, rain, and certainly anyone that wants to do any damage to your head. The armies of Europe were essentially attired so, from one end of the extreme or to the other, straight from the pages of history, with universally ornamental headgear, in some cases rather garishly, and we'll get to that. The cavalry in 1914 was still a sight to behold. The cavalry of 1914 marched off to war in polished breastplates, brass helmets with horsehair plumes, or heavy cuirass helmets like this monstrosity, lancers, heavy sabers, lightsabers, not lightsabers. Yeah, that would be a massive jump in technology. We're way ahead of ourselves here. Lightsabers. The cavalry was literally a living watercolor painting of the Battle of Waterloo in 1914. By 1918, all of that, absolutely all of that changed. In 1918, you have 20-ton armored tanks moving across battlefields to engage the enemy. Now, I know you're thinking, well, yeah, but they got stuck in the mud and they were slow and they were loud. Yes, yes, yes. The First World War was 4 years long. So picture in 1914, your freshman year of high school, you couldn't take the bus because it didn't exist. Your senior year, 20-ton battle platform moving across the battlefield with multiple weapon systems on board, the ammunition to serve those weapons and a crew to serve those weapons. That's a yawning gulf between those two ends. Powered flight had taken an incredible leap from 1914 to 1918. In 1914, your freshman year, you had a suicide kite with an engine in front of it. In 1918, we have multi-wing battle platform attack aircraft featuring multiple forward-firing machine guns, sometimes a rearward-firing machine gun with a separate crew member, capable of engaging targets in the air and targets on the ground. The British Air Force was working on, towards the end of the war, a Sopwith Camel that would feature a underbody-mounted flamethrower to strafe the trenches with living flame. Enormous bomber aircraft roamed the sky, bombing targets well beyond the battlefield. The Zeppelin-Strachan 4, German language is a beautiful language. The Zeppelin-Strachan was a biplane bomber with a wingspan of 140 feet. To put that in perspective, the B-52 Stratofortress, which is the largest aircraft in our arsenal currently and the largest aircraft we've ever produced, has a wingspan of 185. Zeppelins too, not Zeppelin 2, but like Zeppelins as well, they had advanced dramatically by this point in the war as well, regularly leaving Germany and flying to targets as far away as Scotland or North Africa for bombing raids. I have been to Edinburgh, Scotland, and stood in Edinburgh Castle, and you can look out onto the buttresses that face the town, and there's scarring on the walls in Edinburgh Castle from German Zeppelin raids during the First World War. Massive leap in technology in a small space. But what of the individuals, what was the human response to this onslaught of technology? I want to give one final example of technology. I almost skipped over it. I can prattle on as all these things, and we're not here to talk about technology all night, but one more example will serve the point. In 1918, at the end of the war, the combatants didn't know it was the end of the war, but they kind of knew. The writing was on the wall. The armies of Europe had fought themselves white. They had been in the same positions for years in some places, could not advance, could not retreat. The German army in 1918 had one last dice throw. As you may recall, in 1917, the Tsar Alexander of Russia abdicated, we'll use that word, and the new communist government signed a peace treaty with the German army immediately. And so they suddenly had 60 new divisions that they could apply to the Western Front facing the other way. Kaiser knew this, the military planners of Germany knew this. They said, we have one last dice throw. We need to do something with these soldiers before America gets here, because they essentially have an endless supply of soldiers, and once they get here, that's over. So they did. The last battle of the German offensive on the Western Front, the Kaiserschlacht, another beautiful German names, King's Battle, advanced suddenly on the Western Front and took everybody by surprise and advanced dozens of miles, which is a lot of movement in the First World War. But as they did so, they cleared the way for a Wunderwaffen, a wonder weapon, a terror weapon of such incredible proportions, a weapon that the German army had been working on for years, a weapon that would ultimately send the first man-made object into space, a weapon that would create the first man-made sonic boom. Yes, not unlike the armies of Mordor advancing towards Minas Tirith with the wolf-headed battering ram of Grond. The German army brought with them a weapon known to history as the Paris gun, and they got it to within 80 miles of Paris, which was still close enough to shell the city hundreds of times. Because when the weapon fired, it fired around 26 miles into the air, entering lower outer space, traveled 80 miles through airless space, re-entered our atmosphere with a sonic boom over the city of Paris, and shelled it hundreds of times. That's a terror weapon in 1918. 1914, I'm riding a bicycle to the frontiers. In 1918, we're firing artillery rounds into outer space. The technological onslaught during those 4 years is the stuff of science fiction, and the human response to it is paradoxical. The human response to this onslaught of technology caused us to regress and to bring out technologies that had been missing, like I said, from the fields of battle for hundreds of years. We see a reemergence of the steel helmet. The infantrymen of Europe hadn't been wearing steel helmets since at least the end of the English Civil War, the 1690s. We see breastplate armor reemerge that had long since been banished from the battlefield. Chainmail, knives, the personal melee weapon that had been driven from the fields of battle by gunpowder suddenly was very much in vogue and was being supplied by the governments at war. The hand bomb, the hand grenade was prevalent on the battlefields of Europe throughout the Napoleonic period until it kind of petered out because of advances in musketry. So advances in musketry drove the hand bomb from the field of battle, yet machine guns brought it back. Very strange when you look at it in that way. And so, to me, that's what this war represents, is this strange paradox where we just continue to invent technologies and continue to invent weapon systems as a way to try to break the stalemate on the Western Front, and in the process, we essentially went medieval. The response to machine guns, poison gas, flamethrowers, armored assaults, tanks, flamethrowers from planes, artillery being launched into space is literally put on breastplate armor, carry a spiked club, and wear a steel helmet. So, I know you guys didn't want to come here tonight for a lecture. We are going right into knife night after this. I just had to give you a monologue. But before I do, this is a great moment for anybody who made it in late, wants to get a beer, wants to get a donut. Oliver leapt right up. He actually kicked the chair. He actually injured himself to get up to get a beer that fast. Please don't disappoint the man. Also, any questions at this point at all? It's a great time for a roundtable. Yes. Yes.
Are you going to explain how that technology advanced so quickly?
Yes, but from a human perspective, I unfortunately don't have any great engines of war with me tonight. There's no tank idling in the alley out behind. So talking about technology that isn't here, I don't want to make it, lose the visceral nature of being able to see exactly. This is really, Knife Night is supposed to be the focus of the human impact of the onslaught of technology. But it is remarkable, when the artillerists fired that Paris gun, they had to take into effect the Coriolis effect, which is the curvature of the Earth and the speed of rotation of the Earth, because the artillery shell was in the air for 3 minutes. That again, that we had no idea that outer space was where it was. I mean, we knew where the planets were. We've certainly been studying the skies since Galileo, and before. But the idea of, we think that there's no air past this point, and so the artillery shell should travel some distance. I'm just picturing Kaiser Wilhelm like, yeah, get to the point. So outer space, yeah, what are we talking about here? Are we going to shoot the moon? No, we're not. Okay, cool. Yeah, here's the money, build the gun. Yeah, actually, the rail car ones were World War II. You have Schwer Gustav, which was the famous big artillery piece that was shelled Russia from Germany a number of times. The Paris gun was basically, once they got it into position, was a very permanent piece of equipment. It's essentially a living, breathing base where you had 100 people or more working on this gun. The barrel was held up by a crane because it's so long that it couldn't support its own weight. It's a very grotesque. It's this. The thematic elements here is that we have brutality mixed with Monty Pythonian kind of nonsense. There's both times that they shadow each other throughout the whole conflict. Is everybody thoroughly refreshed? Are there any other questions? Steph?
How much was ingenuity on the front? You said that a lot of it was being provided by the government, but how much of this was people kind of making things up as they go along?
The cottage industry of the war, when things go off the rails, which is this blanket, that's when all the plans have failed and everybody is just making their own little weapons until the government finds out about it and either supports it or squashes it. In the beginning, it's very much you're issued, this is your weapons and this is what you use. So yeah, when we get to the ugly side of things, the Monty Python brutality, then we'll see there's some dumb stuff over here that totally soldier made. Okay. Frank? No, I like beer and donuts? Okay. In 1914, like I said, the armies of Europe marched off to war right out of the pages of history, and the soft headgear that the infantry were wearing in Germany was the Pickelhaube, which everyone has seen this in propaganda pictures and things like that. This became a symbol. In fact, I believe the poster is "Stop This Mad Brute," was the propaganda poster that featured an ape wearing a Pickelhaube attacking an innocent woman. The reason why I'm holding this so gingerly is it's 130 years old and it's made from boiled leather. This offers absolutely zero protection to the wearer. None. We have some brass. Not only does it sit really high on your head, but it's brass and boiled leather. If you were to take a handful of alley rocks and throw them at somebody wearing this helmet, you have a solid chance of injuring them. But this was military tradition, and this is what was worn. And the caps of France were the kepi, the caps of England were a soft crushed wool hat. Literally, this was the most propaganda piece of it, though, because all of these eagles, the Wappen on the front of the Pickelhaube, is actually an advertisement of what nation you represent. So these are Prussia, that's the heraldic Prussian eagle. Saxony, Baden, Bavaria, all had a different animal on the front of your boiled leather silly hat that said, "We're here to do war unto you." And the infantry marched off with giant bolt-action rifles. Most of the patterns were from the 1880s. They were incredibly powerful, and with them came the bayonet. The thinking of combat in the First World War at the beginning was still very much, we're going to pin them down with fire, and then we're going to close with the enemy, and we're going to give them the cold steel. That's what these were always referred to. Give them the cold steel. This is the bayonet for the French main battle rifle, Lebel, model 1884. This couldn't be more archaic. You notice how I'm handling it. There is no bladed edge to this. It's just a spike. The whole idea of this is we're going to advance on the enemy and bravely jam it right into their chest. It wasn't happening right off the bat. Also, this is called, does anyone know what this is called? The quillion is mounted on this little hook. So when you're the lowly infantryman and you have your giant rifle and this mounted, and here comes a cavalryman to hit you with his sword, you're simply to parry the blow, chase the blade down here, and wrench the sword right out of his hand with the quillion. So yeah, this was really old school by 1914, and the French knew it, but they didn't care because military tradition. And this bayonet has the nickname Le Rosalie, because if you look at it, it's a four-sided blade, and supposedly, if you jam this into somebody's chest and you pull it out, it leaves a rose-shaped blood splotch before it fades out until you bleed out. Beautiful. Poetic, yeah. I don't have, yeah, very French. I don't have bayonets from every nation. The English representation was this blade bayonet, the Wilkinson blade bayonet for their Enfields. Really, this is a modern blade, except for the fact that it's a little long. Same idea. We're going to cross with the enemy and jam these into them, and they're going to surrender. Probably before we jam it into them. The cavalry. This ridiculous piece of equipment is a heavy cuirassar's steel helmet, model 1886. This is what the Prussian heavy cavalry were wearing as they clattered off to war. This is as dumb as it looks. You have the big lobster extension on the back, to protect your neck from sword blows that are going to be happening during these sword battles you're going to be fighting on the Western Front, that you're going to be encountering the other nations. And this is the same thing. It's steel. So it's funny. The infantry got boiled leather, but the cavalry got steel. And you have the Wappen and the chin scales, and all of this is basically an advertisement that says, Prussia's here to party. And the cavalry very much, 1914, was the whole idea was, we're going to pin them down with the infantry, the cavalry is going to round out back, and the war is going to be over. The whole thing of the First World War was over by Christmas, over by Christmas, over by Christmas. The lightsaber, not the lightsaber, also right out of the pages of Napoleonic conflict. You'll note here too, if anyone's familiar with cavalry sabers, this has no edge on it, and it's perfectly straight. Battle tactics had changed by the beginning of the First World War. Did anyone see War Horse? That movie from a couple years ago? No? Okay. Well, there's a scene in the movie where the British cavalry charge and they're doing this, and it looks comical. That's it, because all this is just sharp right here. So the whole idea is that we're going to go across a whole battlefield and stick this in somebody. You've lost the ability to attack ground forces at all. If you see a cavalry saber from the U.S. Civil War, it's this big, curved, heavy blade where you're going to strike through and lop off limbs and split heads. This is like a pointer, and here is Beardenhelm. But again, the thematic part of this end of the table is that this is tradition. We have kings on the thrones of Europe. This conflict was begun by an assassination of an archduke. Once you put kings in the mix, tradition is not far behind. You have the armies that are going to roll out as if they've rolled out for hundreds of years before. And that was the whole concept here, is that we're going to use tradition to destroy the Germans or destroy the French or destroy the Belgians, whoever it is that we're going to walk into. This was it. Any questions about the beginning of the war before we get into the less pretty parts of the war? No questions about bayonets, swords, or helmets. Okay. All right. Well, it's going to get weird. You guys will have questions, I promise you. So that's 1914. The human element of it charges off to war, and we have open combat on the frontiers for roughly the first couple of months. Winter comes, 1914 to 1915, and all the great thinkers of the armies at play say, okay. We're going to settle down. It's winter now. We're not going to be doing this stuff over the winter. Let's just kind of make defensive positions, and then come spring, you'll see all this stuff's going to work out. And it didn't. It didn't at all. 1915 saw nothing but savage flailing at one another, and the equipment proved to be inefficient. We get to the middle war period. We see a big change around 1916. We start digging defensive trenches. We see the reemergence of the steel helmet. The whole process, though, the whole thought behind it was that these defensive positions we're digging are purely temporary. No, we're still going to use them to attack at the right moment We're only hanging out here until it's time to go. We're not going to make these elaborate. And as we're hunkering down in these trenches, temporary as they were supposed to be, we're starting to experience a lot of head injuries because the soldiers are buried up to the dirt. You're coming up over the top to operate your weapon, and the boiled leather cap isn't cutting the mustard. And so the armies of Europe are starting to see a large amount of casualties from this, and the powers that be say, okay, fine. Okay, fine. So the Germans were always first. Always remember that. I know history's messy and it's not politically correct to say that. The Germans are always first. This is the Stahlhelm, a beautiful language, steel helmet, model 1916. This is the archetypical helmet that you see like this, that conjures up the images of the First World War, the big, heavy coal scuttle helmet. And when these were released, this is not military issue. When these were released to the armies, the Kaiser said, okay, I'm going to protect your head, but you serve me. So everybody who gets one of these, here's a pen, you put your name in it, because that's yours. Now, can you imagine if a president gave you a hat now, and you were like, oh, but you want me to put my name in it? This was a king. The guy who wore this was Gevta Wedel, and he wore this proudly in 1916. It has the liner with horsehair pads. This was actually a nice gift from the Kaiser as far as things go. This was a massive improvement over the football helmet. And also these lugs are supposed to be vents. I don't know how much cooler this is on a summer day with the air percolating through here, but it gives it that Frankenstein kind of like menacing look. And it also, later in the war, there was an armor plate that mounted on this that hinged off of these called the Sternfinse, because Germany. Well, all the other nations were like, okay, now we need helmets. So France gave us the Adrian helmet. This is a stamped steel. This color, by the way, is the color of the French uniform from 1915 going on. They lost the scarlet trousers because right after the beginning of the war, they realized the dye came from Germany. And so there was no more dye. And so they switched to kind of a muddy blue. That was the best they could do. What's interesting about this helmet, it's stamped steel. It's a multi-piece. You can see that it's nowhere near as heavy duty as this. But what I always found remarkable about this is that France's mortal enemy in this whole conflict is Germany. Germany attacked France. France does not like Germany. What's the first thing they do when they come out with a helmet? Do the same like front-facing plate thing that Germany did. So this is the flaming bomb of the Republic of France. And that was to, let everyone know, as if you didn't know, with our blue helmets, we're French. This is actually an American helmet. I don't have a Brody. The Brody was the British helmet. The British public ridiculed the release of these helmets in 1916 or around that time, because this is really close to the British infantry helmet that were being worn in the 1600s. And the British public was like, oh, right. So this is what we've come to. And for better or for worse, this is actually my great uncle's helmet. It's a family heirloom, like I said, but the American helmet is exactly the same. This helmet has its detractors. It has its benefits. Clearly, it's good from stuff from the air. Not so good if you have to hit the dirt. Because, yet this proved to be effective enough that the British wore this straight through the Second World War. We wore it in the First World War, and we wore it at the beginning of the Second World War. Now, helmets come out because we're receiving head injuries. What are we receiving head injuries from? Artillery, shrapnel, rifle rounds. And we reach a point with air power at the point in the war here where something weird is happening. Aircraft at the beginning, again, were suicide kites. But by this part of the war, they've started to grow faster and further. And they're starting to see each other as the Germans are going one way and the British are going the other way. They used to just wave at each other, literally, because the planes weren't strong enough to support weapon systems. But they're starting to wave a lot less at this point in the war, and they're starting to engage each other. And as the men on the ground realize, wait a minute, 3 days ago, a bunch of German planes flew over our lines, and now today the artillery fire is landing right on our lines. They're taking pictures. So like any good infantryman and any soldier in any conflict since the dawn of time, they started shooting randomly at the planes as they went past. Well, the airplanes were slow and they flew low, and these rifles were very powerful. So pilots were starting to get shot. And so they were coming back to base and saying, we need something to attack the ground with. And they said, well, you've got a machine gun in the front. Yeah, I can dive, but I can't pull out. The planes were just continuing down to the ground and exploding, which is a bummer for the pilot. So a bit of Monty Pythonian flair, the natural thing they came up with is said, okay, the plane is only strong enough to have you and the engine and one gun, but we can't shoot at the ground because the plane will crash. Plane is not strong enough for a bomb, and really one bomb's not going to cut the mustard anyway. I know. Hear me out. What about a picnic basket mounted to the side of the plane with a rope that goes to the front, and the picnic basket is full of spikes? Just hear me out on this. And then when you fly over the trenches, you just pull the rope, and then the spikes will come out. So what we have here is flechettes. Now, flechettes had existed in military jargon since the dawn of time. There's a skull in the British Museum that has one of these jammed right in the forehead of it out of a Roman siege engine called a scorpion. So these have been around a long time. They fly a lot further and a lot harder than a dart, or than an arrow. They're solid steel, they have a shaft, but gunpowder kind of made darts disappear from the fields of battle. Suddenly, in 1916, these became a great idea. Now, you're looking at this and thinking, yeah, okay, so a picnic basket full of darts. Hear me out. Planes, say the plane's at 1,600 feet. It's pretty low. He's going about 110 miles per hour. This is a 1-ounce high-carbon, razor-sharp dart. And if it comes out of the bottom of the picnic basket of war mounted to the side of the rumpity-bumpity suicide kite that is the attack aircraft, and you, like a good infantryman, is standing on the ground wearing your felt cap, firing away at it, if one of these were to strike you in the head coming down at that speed and velocity, they generally pass through your entire body and came out your leg or somewhere down at the bottom, rendering you dead. Right off the bat, when these started getting deployed, flechetting, getting flechetted, I'm not sure there's an action verb on these, but dropping flechettes on the infantry, immediately there was a disclaimer that went out to the armies of Europe that said, if you feel that you're maybe getting flechetted, get out of the trench and lay on the ground. Lay flat. Well, because if the arrow goes this way, you might hit less organs than if you're looking up and it goes in your right ear and comes out your left butt cheek. So, some more of a survivable wound, laying flat, but the next best thing after laying flat was to put a steel helmet on. So really, we see this comical resurgence of Roman battle darts, and it drove then the medieval response of getting steel helmets from the pages of history. We also see a reemergence of something that had kind of disappeared since the Napoleonic times, the infantry speaking trumpet, the trench bugle. We're still trying to attack here. The whole idea is that we're in this little trench, but at the right moment, you just wait. We're all going to come out of here. As long as we're not getting flechetted that day, we're going to go and we're going to win. Well, we all have to go at once. If we have a trench line that's a couple miles in either direction, if it's full of infantrymen ready to go, they all have to go at the same time. We can't have these guys be 5 minutes before those guys. So this is before radios. This is before any form of real communication. So we see a resurgence of essentially the Napoleonic trench speaking trumpet. This particular one was made by the Wurlitzer Company in Chicago in 1917. Quick blasts of these could direct soldiers on the ground. It was the first time that was really happening since the Civil War, our Civil War. And you see anyone who's ever seen a movie about the First World War or played a video game, the trench whistle, the British officer's trench whistle is I think, archetypical, quintessential, the shrill, there's no ball in it. It's just a really bright, like, train whistle. This one's from 1915. The British officers sent their soldiers out the trenches with these whistles, but how could we do this all at the same time? We have to know what time it is. Pocket watches have been around for many years prior to the First World War, and they proved immediately not good in the trenches. You have this big, beautiful, gilded watch stuck in your vest with a chain. We're suddenly up to our waist in water and mud. This is not working. Also, the airplanes of the time, going back to that, had very few, if any, gauges. They used to chalk on the fuselage before you took off fuel consumption per hour and how much fuel you have. So the pilot needed to know what time it was because he could run out of gas. Well, a pocket watch at 105 miles per hour while you're trying to steer the suicide kite wasn't happening either. So the wristwatch was born of the First World War. This is a model. This was from 1916. It was produced by the Tavant Company in Switzerland. Who's got the time? You got the time. What's your watch say? 6:06. That's not bad. That would be bad for everybody leaping out of the trenches. I'll give you a 60-second delay would be a bummer. But for the 100+ years this has been ticking, that's not bad. Basically, we took a pocket watch and shrunk it down. This still needs to be wound. This is exactly the same thing as a pocket watch, but now you get that image of the British officer with the watch and the whistle, because we're all going to go off at 6:10. And you get that thing from all the old movies. Gentlemen, synchronize your watches. That's what that line is because it doesn't need to be the right time. We just all need to be on the same time. So this is actually born of the First World War. It's about the only good thing that came from any of this stuff on this table, because if it wasn't for this, we might still be using pocket watches. But pilots could then use this. You'd say, oh yeah, I got about 40 minutes of gas left. I should probably start heading back home. Did I drop all my death darts? Yes? Okay, good. Then it's time to go. So you can probably surmise that we started out with a great plan. We had some great intentions. Everything felt really good. And then things started to come off the rails a little bit, but it was like, no, it's fine. No, it's fine. We're just going to change the uniforms a little bit. We're going to come up with some couple of things, but we're still going to win this war the same way we started it, with massive attacks, massive frontal charges. We're going to use bayonets. We're going to do all that stuff. Yeah, there's darts and things, but it's going to be cool. But after the middle of the war, things completely and utterly collapse in the conflict. This is a good spot to pause for questions. Beers, donuts. Nobody's eating a donut. There's a whole tray of donuts. Yes.
First, I'll help with the donuts.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
So I know machine guns were invented long before.
Yes.
Were they not incorporated early in the war? Because it was like, well, you can't carry it around with you. You can't tie it to your horse.
Right.
You can't,
The machine gun is
wasn't good for offensive
right.
warfare.
Right.
What you're planning on doing.
Right. That's a fabulous set of intertwined questions.
And I know it. Yeah, I know how devastating it was once everybody
Yeah.
in their trenches and waited.
Yes. No, the machine gun serves.
Kind of have them, but not use them at all?
It's a very strange journey. Now, Hiram Maxim was a German man who was living in New York. He invented the Maxim gun in America, and the American Army said, how dare you? We win wars by charging with bayonets and swords. Well, you know who had a ready ear was Germany. They were like, oh no, we like this idea. And all the generals were like, well, that's unmanly. That's going to suck all the traditions out. And the Kaiser said, I don't care. I wear the big hat. Start building them here. Well, prior to the First World War, heavy machine guns were used, unfortunately, to subjugate those with no technology. You know, the reason why Africa was all colonized in the 1880s and 90s is because of machine guns. At the outbreak of the First World War, America had none, zero, that were... We had the Colts and the Hotchkiss and these weapons from like the 1880s, but as far as a modern machine gun, we had zero. I should qualify that. France had a few. England was really against them. It was like, no, we have 1,000 years of military tradition here, and we win by wearing hats and carrying swords. At the first battle, the Battle of the Frontiers, is all rifles. It's literally riflery. There was some machine guns that were being deployed, but like the Maxim machine gun in 1914, the gun itself, I think, weighs 75 pounds. The stand it sits on is 100 pounds. It needs roughly 10 gallons of water, and then 250 round belts of ammunition are about 20 pounds each. And it fires 600 rounds a minute, so we're going to need more than one. Very heavy, cumbersome, like you said. Machine guns were not an offensive weapon, really, at the beginning of the war. The advent of the squad machine gun was not long in the making, though. The Lewis machine gun is around 1915, 1916. The Shosho, Americans always deride the Shosho, the Shoshat that has the weird, like, see-through magazine. Have you ever seen what I'm talking about? Yeah, the Marines had to use them when they landed, and they hated them. So that's why we have this image of it being this, like, useless machine. It's very useful. It's a 20-round magazine. It fires 300 rounds a minute, so it's really slow. You could walk with it. That's what we need, is stuff you could walk with, not a gun that's as big as this entire table. Once that kind of stuff happened is mid-war, then you start to see, it's funny, offensive, small machine guns basically were invented when it was too late. Basically, now we were dug in, and By the end of the war, there was a German infantry phrase, alles nur 028, is literally everything is 0815. 15. Alles nur 0815. Everything is 0815. Basically, everything, all I see is this machine gun. Everything is 08015. So to say I'm having a normal day, everything is 0815. That was the model of the machine gun. They were parked hub to hub in some parts of the Western Front. There was absolutely, war movies make it look like, okay, guys, get ready. And then they rush a little bit, and then they duck a little bit. No. The machine gun by the middle of the war they're called no man's land for a reason. Yes.
So, it's kind of a broad question, but
It's good.
Given the different allocations for making groups of Western Front, okay, take Paris, and the war next quick, did like the different allocations how did that affect the military?
That's a fabulous question. Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. It's a question after my own heart. I should have prefaced this with we're primarily going to be speaking about the Western Front. Most, if not all, of these artifacts are from the Western Front, which is traditionally the front between Germany, Belgium, and France. Yes, absolutely. This was a world war in every sense of the word. We picture World War II and we're fighting in the Pacific. We're fighting all over the place. Maybe the combat wasn't as spread out in the First World War, but yes, absolutely. The Eastern Front, the Siberian Front, the North African Front, the Italian-Austrian Front, and technology changed from one end to the other, and you're absolutely correct. The German military invested almost all of their money into the Western Front because they wanted to get into Paris. Funny, they won the War of 1870 and completely subjected France below their heel, and then they still wanted it anyway. The war on the Eastern Front, they didn't have to allocate funds because the Russian army in 1914, something I think 78% of their soldiers were illiterate. The first instances of Russian soldiers seeing German aircraft, the entire army fell on the ground and started praying because that was an aberration to Christ. Because the Tsar Alexander was supposed to be their conduit to the living Lord. And it says in the Bible, the man doesn't fly. If we were flying, we would have had wings. So literally, that's how backwards the Russian army was at the beginning of the war. Germany didn't have to allocate too many funds to that. What they did do is they moved funds around. And so when they realized that cavalry was not cutting the mustard on the Western Front, they sent them east. Cavalry on the steppes of Russia was very effective. You have big open spaces where there are no trenches. Great, that's what horses are good at. That's where horses came from. In the North African campaigns, you don't ever see any of this stuff. We don't see trench clubs. There's no trenches. It's a lot of movement and things like that. So you're right. The technology that the Paris gun that's shooting artillery rounds into space on the Western Front, that's a technological leap that was way beyond what's happening in Africa. In Africa, I was like, we ended the war with pretty much the same technology that we began it with, bolt-action rifles and swords. Fabulous question. It's really good. Anything else? Anyone else got a comment, concern? There has to be a concern at this point. No? Yeah?
And following up that, not.
No, yeah, don't even try. That's it.
How effective were the helmets at actually protecting people? Like, obviously, I don't know if something hitting terminal velocity, if even those can stop it. Like,
No.
are they more for shrapnel?
It's more for the rocks and things that are thrown up from an artillery strike, shrapnel from an artillery round. This helmet probably would stop a handgun round from the First World War at distance, or at least deflect enough energy from it that you might survive the wound. The Adrian, probably not so much. The Brody, probably not so much. The rifle rounds of the period were, 8mm Mauser rifle rounds for the German Gewehrherr 98 rifle is something insane, like 3,800 feet per second and 2,900 pounds of energy. The sights on those rifles go up to like 3,000 yards. You're literally taking shots from Iowa and Indiana with these things. So the idea that you're going to ping a rifle round off your helmet is not so much. Better than a wool cap. Yeah, well, that's just it. You give somebody a false sense of security. Sometimes that's just as good as real security. And, If he doesn't live the tale to tell the tale, then I guess the next guy will also have the false sense of security and so forth. Yes. Yes. That's a really good question. I didn't bring a kitchen scale. The German helmet is definitely the heaviest. This is one piece of steel. You can see old black and white pictures of these being stamped in a hot press. So this is actually rather thick with the rolled edges. This is by far the heaviest helmet here. And then the Brody is actually pretty heavy. The Adrian is pretty tinny. There's not a whole lot to this. This is well under a pound.
But it looks great.
It looks great, and that's the thematic idea behind the entire French military.
Well, and that's the thing. So protection is better with the weight, but then your ability to be more mobile is
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. And the big detractor of this too is you'll see this is the only helmet here that's protecting the sides of your head. German soldiers couldn't hear anything because you have the whole, you would get tunnel hearing, especially since the First World War was so incredibly loud that the soldiers were doing this all the time. Huh? What? Yes.
I noticed the German helmet's out of strap. Is that just missing, or is
It's because I'm missing a strap. Actually, you know, to thank you. No, to do one better though, this helmet's brand new. This was my great uncle's, and he served in the Siberian expedition, and it was never worn. It still has the fitting tag in it because when he went to Siberia, it was 40 below zero, so they didn't wear these, and they were fighting Cossacks who weren't using artillery. So this was out the window. So I have his entire footlocker, and this is brand spanking new from 1917. But yeah, that's why the strap is on this one because it never got used, and the French one because it's a miracle. The German one, the strap would go. I might as well long out. The strap would use these weird bales all the way out over here, so it's not actually part of the entire webbing system. That's for my decoration. It's not part of. Yeah, this isn't the German design styrofoam from. Yeah, no, I blended that on purpose. But the design of this too then puts the strap really far out on your head, so it kind of makes your head swim in it a little bit. Case in point, though, the Germans knew that was coming in. So this is a size 66. They actually had these made in different size centimeter for your head. So they would try at least to get a helmet that fit your head. Didn't always work out that way. And if you dropped it, you're going to, hey, is that my helmet? You know, it's, yeah, right. Okay, well, if there's no more questions or comments or concern, then we're going to get into the ugly side of things, the part of Knife Night that all of you are secretly, quietly pining for. Yes, yeah, the part that makes barbers go whoop is the dirty, nasty bit of the war. This is the part that, as Tyler and I were talking prior to this starting, from 1916 on, it was punishable by death to be caught with a camera on the Western Front, period. You would be shot out of hand or hung, regardless of sex, period. The planners of this war knew that the train had derailed at this point and that it was getting ugly, and they were going to have a really tough time selling war bonds and having, you know, recruitment drives in these little towns in England and in France. If pictures were in the newspaper of soldiers with studded clubs and grenades hanging off their belts and knives all jammed in. And at this point in the war too, by the end of, I will get into the end of 1916. By the end of 1916, there was no more movement on the Western Front, but you're having killing every day. We get introduced to a new military term in 1916 called wastage. Wastage was applied to the Western Front, and that is casualties incurred doing nothing. And it ran anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 a day. Soldiers being killed just living in trenches, not attacking, not retreating, not defending. 6,000 to 10,000 per diem, per day. They didn't want pictures of this for the folks at home because there was no way to dispose of the bodies. And so No Man's Land was turning into a Slayer album. Just heaps of bones and rats. At the end of 1916, you have the two cataclysmic battles that decided this transition into this period. You have the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of Verdun is often listed as the most futile and most disgusting battle ever fought in Western Hemisphere. It's a toss-up because the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II was longer and more casualties, but Verdun was 9 months long, was the size of Naperville, and incurred a couple million casualties and accomplished nothing. I've been there. Walking around the place today, it's not charry. It's not a good place to be. Still a lot of signs that say, don't go over here, don't do that. Signs, don't drink the water. Every day at Verdun, the national park, people that work there, their job starts every day where they leave the national park office with a red velvet bag and they walk the grounds, because the grounds give up bones every day, every single day. And those bones are put in those red bags and brought to a building called the ossuary, which kind of looks like our Capitol building, where they're blessed. And then they open a great door and they're thrown onto the heap. Not unlike the pile of treasure that Smog is on, it's all bones. Couldn't be more futile. That is the result of the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme. The British lost 50,000 soldiers in the first couple hours of the first day, and it lasted for 7 months. So after this bloodletting, the armies gave up and the ugly began. And what symbolizes that to me is this shovel. See, the trenches in this part of the war were meant to be temporary. We're going to dig a hole, we're going to get in it, but we're coming out. We're going to get out of this hole and we're going to win. At this point, it was like, just dig and we'll come up with a plan. The German trenches ended up being 2, 3, 4, 5 lines deep, covering miles of interconnected trench lines with a building called a Stollen, which was buried underground. It was concrete-lined bomb shelters in these trench systems that could survive artillery strikes. This was a hopeless situation. And mind you, these trenches were not dug. They didn't call a ceasefire and bring in steam shovels. They didn't have construction equipment. They were dug with shovels this big and shovels that were this big. And the thing that this symbolizes for futility for me is that this particular shovel is an assault shovel. This was the one that infantrymen started carrying all the time. This one's from 1915. Is that anyone in here ever dug a hole before? Probably at least more than one of you have dug a hole. The part you dig with the shovel is the sharp bit on the front. Put it in a hole and make a potato hole and you do it. This shovel, oddly enough, is sharpened on all sides. And they didn't come that way. Somebody sharpened it on all the other sides. And I don't really see how that helps you dig a hole too well. But judging by the nicks and dents for the edges here, this rapidly became somebody's melee weapon. This is a hatchet that we can also dig a hole with. See, at this point in the war, all bets are off. And what we see is this war in stasis, where we see this reemergence of these technologies. And one of the most comical reemergence is the hand bomb. Now, hand grenades have been around a long, long time. The British military has grenadiers divisions. They're named that because they used to throw grenades. That's why they wear that tall hat, so that you could have an overhand throw and not knock your tricorn hat off. But again, the musketry had advanced to the point where throwing bombs was no longer a viable option of warfare. But when we're stuck in this hole, and some of these trenches were 15, 20 yards apart. So we're talking the German trenches might be the street, and we might be the French trenches. You can almost hear each other talking if it weren't for all this music. And so enterprising young men, being who they are, said, well, the British used to get their beef stew in a tin about this big. It's called mashanochi stew, I believe, and it was terrible from what I understand anyway. You eat the stew, then you pack the can with some gunpowder, you put the lid back on, you get a wick, you stick it in there, you light it, and you throw it. Now it's a meat tin bomb. It's a couple detractors from the meat tin bomb, one of them being the sputtering wick, because the Western Front and the no man's land that separated the lines at this point was basically a quagmire of shell holes and water pits and muck, and anything with a sputtering wick is likely to go out. Also detractor is the giggling over the meat tin while you're trying to light it, and the wick's faster than you think. So when friendly fire meat tin bomb incidences started occurring on the Western Front, the British military got wind of it and they said, absolutely not. Not thousands of years of military tradition will our men be making meat tins and blowing themselves up. So they issued catapults. They issued small trench catapults that ran on 8 springs on either side, where one man would step on the catapult to arm it, the next man would put said meat tin bomb in it and light it. Then the one guy takes his foot off, and now this meat tin bomb can fly a safe distance and incur no friendly casualties in the trenches. The French saw the meat tin bomb party going on their other end of the line, and they said, we can do one better than that. The French gave us this. This is a pétard raquette, which I butchered the French language worse than German, so I apologize deeply. This is a piece of wood with a bomb wired to it, but it's given a military name for whatever reason. Sometimes the wire was barbed wire, sometimes it was just wire. Again, inert. We're not going to have any friendly fire explosions tonight. This is ground dug, hence the wood condition. The Model 1 of this was a cylindrical bomb wired to a board, and the manual said, since the French soldier will not fight if he cannot smoke, simply have him drag upon his cigarette, then bring the bomb to his face to light it, and then throw it at the Germans. Right off the bat, some problems with this design. The aforementioned wet land in between the lines where sputtering wicks could go out, that's a problem. But two, the bit where you throw the bomb up to your face to light it before it goes, I'm sure the friendly fire incidences involved in this were ugly. And so when word got back to the French military that our men are hurting themselves in dastardly ways with these things, this actually is a Model 2. If you look closely at this later, or you could almost see it in my hand, there is 2 indentations in the board here, and that is where a striker igniter used to reside. And so this had a piece of tin folded over the top when you hung it on your belt. When it was time to deploy, you would take it off your belt, presumably put the cigarette in your mouth so that you could open the tin lever, and then you throw it at the Germans and hope to throw it so it lands face down. And the piece of wood falls out. And that little plunger then is going to compress and ignite the bomb. Now, if anyone's ever played lawn darts, you have to throw them pretty perfectly for them to go up and come back down and stick in the dirt. If this lands on its side, an enterprising German soldier could sneak out, grab it, and throw it back. And this turns into the worst game of badminton ever. Because one of 2 things is either going to happen with this. It's going to land on somebody and blow up, or it's going to get lost in no man's land in between our lines and be found the hard way later. A solution was needed in this arms race of hand bombs, and it was the Germans who came to the table first with a modern design. Again, it's just the way it is, it's history. Anyone who's ever seen a World War II movie, a World War I movie, played a video game, the potato masher hand grenade was what was invented. The Stahlhandgranat, model 1915, steel hand grenade. The bomb part's missing from this. That's why it looks a little small. That's why this is safe. The design of this is ingenious. There's a wooden handle, stamped right on there, 5.5 seconds. No more sputtering wick in your face to determine, is this going to blow me up while I'm lighting it? I am given 5.5 seconds to get rid of this, or I'm going to have a problem. There's a bomb that screws onto the end here with a hook that can hang on my belt. This handle is hollow, and out pops a string when you unscrew the other end cap. The other end cap kind of looks like a faucet spigot on the outside of your house. You unscrew that. This little hollow one here supports a porcelain ball that pops out on a string, and you now, whenever you're ready, you pull this, you got 5.5 seconds to get rid of this, and you don't have to be good at sports to be able to throw something on a stick. The Germans revolutionized the bomb throwing game. When these came out, all of the meat tin catapults and the fireworks on sticks kind of became old school. We see then, right after this, and by the way, these were 3.5 second, 5.5 second, and 7.5 second. Best to read the handle before you pull it, because there is a big difference between the 3.5 and the 7.5, depending on what you're doing. Right after this, the British followed this up with what was known as the Mills bomb. If you see Google images of that, because I don't have one, the Google images of that basically is our modern fragmentation grenade. It's a pin, it's a handle that primes it. No more sputtering wick, no more meat tin disaster. This goes off. And then from that point on, hand grenades became a serious part of Western Front warfare. There are Google images of German soldiers, they don't have anything else but grenades. They're just covered in grenades. I'd hate to be that guy to trip and fall, but just all these guys were doing is you would sneak out to the closest point and just throw bombs at each other all day, hence the wastage. The 6,000 to 10,000 men that were killed daily for no reason, throwing bombs at each other. Now, when the bomb game started, it kind of took the lid off of decency. Because if you were willing to take a firework on a stick and throw it at somebody and blow them up, the rules kind of went out the window. Now, at the same time that this is happening, the armies of Europe are running out of men. It's been very costly these couple of years, and the 6,000 to 10,000 men a day game is not boding well for our armies. At this time, all the powers of Europe were still colonial powers. They owned, sorry, that word's not politically correct, they owned other nations around the world. England owned India, Nepal, France owned Senegal and other North African colonies, and they said, hey, why don't we just bring soldiers from those places that could come fight in the trenches? So you have the Nepalese Gurkhas began coming into the trenches around 1916. Now, the Nepalese Gurkha regiments had been fighting with the British Army since the 1860s, and they were known for this alone. This is a kukri. This is one of history's only examples of a forward-facing sword or knife. The idea being that your force will be multiplied with a forward strike because the blade will strike the enemy before your hand does. The Nepalese Gurkha was extremely fearless and was known to just throw his rifle down and charge with these. The Germans did not like these people. This particular kukri, I can't tell you when it was made because there has no dates on it, but Nepal got electricity in 1942, I know that. And so this kukri, if you look at it in the light, is real wavy, which tells me that someone in a village still made this over an open charcoal pit. So this is safe to say this is plenty old to have served in the First World War. Well, here the British soldiers are sitting there lighting meat bombs and throwing them at each other, and they see these guys come filing in with these things. And they're like, "Aw, what's going on with that?" And the French soldiers on their side of the line are busy throwing fireworks back and forth, and here come their soldiers from Senegal. France owned Senegal, and they had a Senegalese infantry regiment that was trained by French officers and was considered one of the most fearsome units in the world at that time. And when they came into the trenches, they were all universally bigger than everybody else. This is what you read. You just got to regurgitate it. Universally bigger than everybody else, and they carried with them this knife, not sword, knife. This knife was French issued, military issued. This one was made in Paris by the Lerec company, if you care. This was issued with the decree that the knife for this colonial use needed to be large enough and heavy enough to paddle a small watercraft, heavy enough to do bush clearing and yard work, and strong enough to defend yourself from man or beast. And I'm fairly certain this cuts the bill. This knife has an official military name, but the French soldiers that wielded it called it le coucou. Le coucou. It's French for chop chop. And by the looks of the blades on this thing, I think this thing's done some le coucou. It is nicked up, dinged up, crooked in one spot. Mind you, it's over a 1/4 inch thick, so I don't know what you hit with this to nick it and bend it a little bit. My mind wanders. But when the Senegalese soldiers entered the trenches and they looked down at their pathetic French counterparts and they're down there giggling with these fireworks, they said, "That's enough, man. We need knives too." Well, the government at the time said, "Sure, yeah, knives, we got it. We're going to start cranking out knives." I have a selection of trench knives here. They lend heavily in France, so I can really speak viscerally about the French experience. It's pretty universal across the board how the nations responded to the need for melee weapons suddenly. France, bless their heart, they had lost the War of 1870, and the weapon that they were using at the time was a Chespeau rifle. It was a really advanced rifle at the time, but since they lost the war, they assumed they needed a new design because that must have been the rifle's fault. So they invented the Lebel rifle in 1884, and they sent the rifles off to colonies or sold them to other countries. But for some reason, they kept the bayonet, and I think I know why. This is one of the biggest bayonets that's ever been issued in military history. This is a bayonet, not a sword. This particular one was made in 1868. This is the bayonet for the Chespeau, Quillian, because we're going to be fighting cavalry with it. And they said, "Hey, we got like thousands of these sitting in mothballs. Awesome." And it was like, "Well, what are you going to do with this? The trench is like 30 inches wide. You want to give a guy a knife this big? He's going to get stuck trying to, this is stupid." I said, well, no. They took them back to the pioneer departments and had them turned into this ugly thing. This one was also made in 1868. This was essentially the beginning of the French knife industry in the First World War. Simply take this enormous bayonet, cut it down to something manageable, cut the quillion off because you certainly aren't fighting cavalry with this. Might as well get rid of that hook. And you're issued this with no scabbard and no anything, and here you go win the war. This proved unsatisfactory. Anyone that looks at this would say, well, the blade is mighty thick, but this is dumb. This is really not a great weapon of war. And so began a weird regressive arms race where France is busy trying to keep up with Germany that's inventing cannons to shoot artillery rounds into space, and British are mounting flamethrowers on planes and so forth. France is like, knives, we need knives, like no other. So they started doing things like taking the Lebel bayonet, and these were taken from the infantrymen because the infantrymen weren't doing anything with them, because they certainly weren't charging across anything and sticking them in anyone. You could see right off, here's one that's got a repurposed handle. We have the grip from the one bayonet, with the really simple double-edged blade soldered into it. I wouldn't be pumped if my nation that I was fighting for issued me this and said, here you go, it's the best we can do for you. Win the war for us, son. But stopgap measure is what this is. We see a theme happening here at this point in the war where the nations that are at war with one another are recognizing the need for melee weapons and ugly types of hand-to-hand weaponry, but they weren't ready for that. There wasn't, the daggers and dirks had disappeared from the belts of infantrymen in Europe hundreds of years prior to this conflict. And so there wasn't really a design ready to issue. The first real close thing that France put out, this one belonged to a guy whose initials are RJ, so he must have thought highly of it. This is accoutrements, is what it was called. I butchered that. You can look that up. I'm sure it's pronounced differently. This knife, these simple knives were cranked out with the blades from labels. So you see these with four-sided spikes driven into a piece of wood. This one happens to be made from a Berthier bayonet, which is another obsoleted rifle that the French army had laying around. They cut these up and turned these into simple little stabbing weapons and issued them to the French soldier, and they even gave him a scabbard this time around. And these, now you start to see these appear in photographs. It's funny. It's punishable by death to take a picture of somebody with a club, but knives all over your uniform, totally cool. So the accoutrements was a stopgap measure. This particular knife must have meant something to RJ. And I think I know why. He must have needed to use it at least once because the hilt on it has a little bit of a cowboy hat bend to it. And that's certainly not from putting it in this leather scabbard too hard. I would have to think that since that's right where my thumb and index finger rest, that this was jammed into something really hard once. So anyway, there's a little bit of willies associated with this knife. From here, this is pure France. This next bit is pure France. It is France just distilled down into one thing. I mentioned the War of 1870. Okay, France lost that war spectacularly. Germany humiliated France during the War of 1870, took from them a portion of their territory, made them pay indemnities, caused the French government to completely collapse. There was absolute anarchy and chaos ruling France for years after the loss in the War of 1870. France does not look on this time period kindly. And in 1914, 15, 16, that wasn't long enough ago that people still didn't remember the war with Germany in 1870. So what better way to equip our soldiers to avenge our loss to Germany in 1870 than with a knife? This is the L'Avengeur. L'Avengeur model French fighting knife. You notice that it's essentially the same pattern of all commando knives that came after it. It's a very elegant, very, very sharp. No, not sharp enough to shave anybody. I'm disappointed. He tried. He tried. But it's not, the tip is very sharp, but we don't shave with that. So, but still, nevertheless, this is an old knife and it's very sharp. And stamped in Le Ricasso, the base of the blade, it literally says, L'Avengeur the 1870, as if to say, young men, gather round. Your forefathers lost a war to Germany once. Go, avenge them. Never mind the machine guns and the tanks and all that stuff. Take this knife and march bravely towards the German frontier. All jokes aside, it's a really clever, quick knife. And now we see that knife fighting starting to get serious. It's not clumsy, dumb, chopped down, unbalanced. This is a really wicked blade. Also has a bent hilt. Probably has a story that I don't want to know. But we start to see this come out. At this stage in the war, all the jokes are over. We're getting purpose-built war knives for the first time in a long time. We have up-to-date our hand bombs. We're all good. Where could we possibly go from here? Well, in one last year, your family was from the Austrian front, which is incredible because that's called the White War, the war between Austria and Italy. And it was, if you think this is futile, that was an absolute farce. It caused the complete collapse of the Italian government. That's where they got Mussolini from. It caused the collapse of the Austrian government. The Habsburg Empire had existed for 600 years in Austria prior to this war. Is because they decided to attack Italy and botch it, that they lost their whole empire. This is the Austrian issue fighting knife. This is government issued. I think out of all of these, I mean, I have big hands, so this really does kind of fit. This knife is really curious because all of these, you kind of tell they probably have a story. There's probably some ugly stuff associated with the cuckoo. The tip of this blade, this extremely high carbon full tang blade, has a kriss to it, a slight kriss, a bend. It means that somebody jammed this into something awfully hard one time, and I'm willing to bet more than one time, because the handle has a couple of notches cut in it, and I don't think those are for grip. So the reason why I point all that out, other than the fact that it's gross and cool at the same time, is that this all seems like fantasy until you realize that it wasn't. That despite high-powered rifles and machine guns and poison gas and flamethrowers, soldiers were still regularly encountering other soldiers close enough to stab them to death. It's a strange, strange war indeed at this point, and it got stranger with trench clubs. That is, I think, the apogee, the complete loss of everything that everyone stood for at the beginning of the war. If I walk down to this side of the table and I look at this elegant lightsaber, not lightsaber, and you look at this saber, and this is every tradition that Europe has ever had, distilled down to the officer corps, the creme de la creme, the mounted men who are going to charge off and win this war for us. And I look at this. It's essentially a table leg with a bunch of heavy nails driven into it. Again, the rumor being on this that this is from the Austrian front, because that was fought in the Alps, and so all their equipment had to be lashed to their body. And so this is missing spikes on one side. Presumptive assumption, but it makes sense. Trench clubs, this one was made by someone not in the military. Somebody made this out in the field. I don't know the story behind it very well. It's got some pretty good gouges out of it, so I imagine it was either dropped really hard a couple of times or saw some things. But just to keep it in scope, this is a ground dug, leaded tip to a British military issue trench club. This has the broad arrow, the same one that's on my watch, the same one that's on the bayonet down there, that broad arrow that says that the military passed this as their inspection. The British military was issuing trench clubs at this point because they had given up on everything too. Fine. Take a spike club, go win the war, is essentially what we're being told at this point. Hence the no pictures, because they weren't real proud of this. Trench clubs came to symbolize, I think, to me and a lot of people who have studied the First World War, the end of everything. The end of all of the hopes and dreams and the traditions of European combat, the kings, the castles, the empires, the glittering uniforms. It all ended in mud and dust and muck in trenches with sticks. This particular club, this is pretty common, soldier made. The artillery rounds were brought up to the front, the fuses separately for safety reasons. The fuses were in boxes with lead lining, so that if you were to drop it or it fell off the horse or it was a bad trip, sparks and things wouldn't ignite the thing of fuses and make it a bummer for everyone holding it. So when the boxes got up to the front, the soldiers descended on those boxes immediately, and they would cut the lead stripping out of it, because lead is extremely malleable. And the soldiers were all issued these hobnails during the conflict. Hobnails to repair your boots or to do whatever you need to do to get some grip in the trenches. And of course, soldiers being soldiers, take the lead from the fuse box, take the hobnails that I was given, give me a piece of wood, and end all of Europe's military tradition. Clubs like these became very prevalent on the Western Front. We don't really see trench clubs in Africa. The soldiers didn't really do that. We also, too, want to point out that is trench armor. That's plate mail. We haven't seen plate mail on the fields of battle for a long time before 1916. Note the design of it too. We still notch the shoulder out, so you could still fire a rifle while you're wearing this plate armor. It's just everything about that doesn't make sense, that you would be issued melee combat armor but still given a provision to fire a rifle. That's where we're at in this point in the war. This represents why the war ended inconclusively. It's why we have Veterans Day. November 11th is the day the First World War ended at 11 o'clock in the morning. It literally said, and time. And everybody stood up in their trenches, they waved, and they turned around, and they walked home, because it had been 4 years of just pointless slaughter. 40 million soldiers served in the First World War, roughly. 9 million became casualties. That gives us a 1 in 4 chance, roughly, of being killed or mangled in this conflict. Subalterns, which were the NCOs of the British Army, had a 22-day survival rate by 1918. They were coming right out of officer school, or at least whatever training they were getting, and essentially being killed immediately. Pilots had a survival rate of a couple of weeks. Tankers had a survival rate of sometimes based on how many missions you made it through. This had just had become absolute madness. And I feel that what represents it the most, oddly enough, aside from all this stabbing and clubbing and stuff, this is the final helmet design of the German army at the end of the war. And it's really no different than this. This is a model 1918. This is a 16. The only difference is that the baling attachment for the stuff you wouldn't care about. But what makes this interesting is that in 1918, somebody high enough up to be able to speak to a king came up to the Kaiser and said, "Kaiser Wilhelm, sir, we're losing men." And he said, I know. That's what we've been doing for years. So we have this idea. We just want to camouflage all the helmets. Let's just camouflage all the helmets, and then we'll camouflage everything else. And the Kaiser said, I don't even know what you're talking about. Okay, I don't care. Paint whatever color you want. Why you bother me with this stuff? But to me, the steel helmet was born again from the 1600s, the 1700s, 1600s, into this modern conflict. So we have this archaic, essentially, piece of equipment that we're now seeing the very first example of military camouflage. That's how the war ended, was a promise, unfortunately, of more to come. Because obviously by World War II, camouflage was on everything. Camouflage is a pretty standard part of military uniforms around the world at this point. But in 1918, this was a fantasy born of somebody's mind to say, well, we're taking casualties because our helmets are green. If they were just a couple colors, maybe we'd win. And that essentially is the futility, the end of the conflict. There has to be a question, a comment, a concern from somebody at this point. Somebody must have something to say. I know you're working on another stupendous one to lob at me. I'm actually, when you raise your hand, I might get low, because that's like ordnance coming this way. But aside from the fabulous question that's brewing in the mind over here, anybody else, Tim?
Let's go back to 1960.
I would love to.
Everything's at a dead stop.
Yes.
Talking about wastage. How much of the wastage was actually from death and despair, disease in the trenches, comparatively to direct combat action?
I have never seen a real distinction on that, because wastage is one of those things that at the time wasn't being admitted. So you don't know how those numbers are being cooked. I find it really difficult to believe that in a section of the Western Front that 10,000 men could die by German bullets and nobody would call that a battle. I would, especially considering that nobody was exposing themselves over the tops of the trenches at this point. So we're talking trench mortars, sniping. That's a lot of effective sniping to create that level of wastage. I think a lot of that probably is going to include trench foot, gangrenous, skin infections, the things you mentioned. The trenches were a biological nightmare at this point. No, you're not getting out to go to the bathroom, and you're also not going to pitch the mangled corpse that just came out of the mud anywhere. There's no time out. Just going to kind of push it back over the top of the trench and hope that the rats go out on that side. Because the rats that were eating the corpses on the Western Front were biting the men in their sleep, because the rats didn't care if you were alive or dead. And so rats that were living, some of the rats, I've seen photographs of German soldiers holding up dead rats, and it's like a beagle. Well, when they have plenty to eat, rats get big. And so those same rats that were carrying the diseases of all those corpses are gnawing on soldiers in their sleep. So that wastage probably includes people who woke up with gangrene or woke up with a digit missing or something like that. And the numbers don't quite work either, because if you take 4 years times 10,000, it doesn't add up quite either. So record keeping for the First World War is not what it was in the Second World War. They have a fairly good idea what happened in the Second World. The First World War is kind of like, well, at the end, this many people were missing, we think. So, and of course you have, was anybody counting how many Senegalese soldiers or Nepalese soldiers got blown up? No. Mahatma Gandhi was an ambulance driver on the Western Front. France owned Vietnam in 1914, and they called it the land of Aman. And so the people from them were Annamites, and Annamites were serving in the Western Front trenches. Do you think the French government counted how many Vietnamese soldiers went into a trench and didn't come out? We've always got more. So yeah, wastage is an ugly, not sure amount. Okay, here it comes. Should I put a helmet on?
So,
Mm-hmm.
after 1916, we kind of stopped talking about aircraft developments. When it came to like soldiers on the ground, we trying to prevent the aircraft fire and bombings beyond like just shooting their rifles up at it,
Mhm.
or their little picnic baskets of death.
Yeah, yeah,
What
nobody
were
wants
the,
that.
Like military developments beyond just like shooting a cannon at it.
Fabulous
that
question.
the infantry used to try to dissuade air attacks.
You. I'm going to sit down and you then just start over again and give your version of this, and I'm going to eat donuts and drink beer. You see right off the bat, it's still kind of a grassroots cottage industry. A really popular thing to do is to get a fence post or a small tree and cut it at a good level and dig a donut in the dirt around it and then mount a machine gun on it. So I could walk around it and fire up into the sky. That's effective. The machine gun's firing the same bullets as the rifles. The venerable French artillery piece, and if anybody's drank gin, they might recognize this name, the French 75. French 75 is a strong drink based on a piece of artillery that the French used in the First World War, the Model 1897 Canon, the 75 millimeter, butchering that completely. But it was a quick firing piece of artillery. They fired a relatively small shell, proved to only be marginally effective once the trenches were dug. Very good for if anybody comes up out of the trench, not so good for getting something in. But since the cannon was relatively small compared to other large pieces of artillery, the same idea of digging a donut around a fence post, started digging a trough to put the tail end of the piece of artillery in the dirt. I do have in my office a couple instances of German Zeppelins being shot out of the sky by 75 millimeter cannons. That had to be an exciting day for the artillery crew too, because the balloon's got to be like this big, and you're just firing away at it with this huge piece of artillery, and then you see a big, you know, you got it. You know that had to be you got it. That'd be a special day. But dedicated anti-aircraft guns really wasn't something that the armies invested in. There was a 1 pound pom-pom gun, fired a 1-inch shell. It was a roughly 1 pound shell, and it was rapid fire. You see pictures of them. There's a famous photograph of a German pom-pom gun crew, and they're standing by what looks like a Maxim gun, only it's much, much bigger. And it has a huge drum on the top that you can see all the rounds in. And it's literally pom, 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 hence the name. Those they found had the velocity and the distance that they could be mounted on the backs of trucks and faced up. But generally speaking, the response on the ground was to hide. But given that, you know, the Red Baron, Alfred von Richthofen, I probably screwed that up too. There, thank you. Thank you. Again, there's a seat right here. You know, he was shot out of the sky by a French soldier wielding a Lebel rifle from the ground. So even the acest of, while saving his cousin, thank you.
Who lived?
Yes.
He did okay.
Yeah, see? So the ace of aces, the number one, the guy on a pizza box, was shot out of the sky with a bolt-action rifle. So, yeah, the response was pretty tepid. You would have thought that there would have been a better response to shooting the planes out of the sky, because I did mention advances in photography happened at a point where there was a camera that could be mounted on the side of a Sopwith Camel that would actually take detailed photographs of the trench lines that could be blown up when developed. And so then the British artillery knew where the German trench lines were, which is a bummer for the people hiding in them. But yeah, the anti-aircraft thing didn't really come to be until the Second World War, which is funny because by the Second World War, the planes are going so fast, the chances of you shooting one out of the sky. I mean, you see those black and white film reels of like the battle in the Pacific, and the planes are flying back and forth. And what the battleship has like a wall of black clouds around it. They're firing so much stuff in the air and they're hitting nothing because the planes are going way too fast. If they would have done that in the First World War, they would have probably shot every single plane out of the sky. It wasn't until the end of the war. The Sopwith Camel is like considered the plane of planes of the British military. And in its final incarnation at the end of the war, when it was its fastest, strongest, best, I think it was cruising speed at 210 miles per hour. Still a pretty slow plane. I mean, if we had a good machine gun, which there were plenty of good machine guns, why somebody didn't think like, well, if we just aim this up. So yeah, not a great response for any aircraft, but fabulous question. Fabulous right off the bat. Both were really good. Who wants to step up to that? Who's got a question to back that up? Come on, I know somebody's.
Tell us a little bit about the photo that you have right there.
Oh, I brought that because it's just an image of futility. If anyone gets a chance to look at it or they want to see things closer later. And backing up to, if you Google image World War I images, there aren't as many as any other war. In the U.S. Civil War, there are more images on the computer than there are the First World War because of that penalty ban on cameras. So this image will pop up on Google. As far as I know, this is the original photo that I own mounted on cardstock. I don't know how that happened, but it has handwriting next to it with a pen. It says, "Our advance on Bochum. I'm in a German trench. Two of our officers with a German anti-tank gun." It's a rifle, folks. It represents the Monty Pythonian futility that was going on. So the British had tanks that were effective enough to be able to cross a battlefield by the end of the war and mount spontan guns. The idea being that you would smash a trench line and then the guns on the side would hose off the trenches as far as you could get and then advance. And by 1918, the German military was just plumb out of steel, really. I mean, trying to crank out the weapons that we're making, but the idea of making a behemoth tank that's going to take 30 tons of iron and might get blown up immediately was not happening. So they came up with a couple of really lousy, comical, stupid tank designs that went nowhere, but they invested their money in this Mauser bolt-action single-shot. I think it's 60 millimeter. It's bigger than our Ma Deuce 50 caliber round. It fires a round bigger than this knife. From what I understand, the soldiers that operated this rifle, there'd be one guy as a spotter and then to pick the guy up, who often either had a detached retina or a broken shoulder after firing the rifle. And you also have to wait until the tank is 60 yards away before you shoot at it, which is, again, kind of like where that old bank is. So I'm going to wait for the tank to get that close while it's shooting at me and everyone around me. And I've got this big Monty Python rifle. Come on, help me pick this thing up. Come on, we're going to knock that tank out. As long as it gets real close. Oh, give me a pillow or something because I don't feel like getting thrown on the ground. So I brought that picture because it kind of symbolizes the stupid town that was the combat on the Western Front by the end of the conflict. Thank you, Steph, wherever she went. Yes.
I can't up to those levels.
No one is going to. Yeah, I'm not going to either.
Is it accurate that before they started mounting machine guns on planes for more air-to-air combat, that the initial way that somebody decided to bring a pistol up and just start plinking away at their friends?
Yeah.
They saw them going the other way and going, well, he's from the other army. I should be
Yeah.
trying to kill him while he's up here.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, you're a single pilot in a single plane that's a suicide kite that you're flying, and you have the fuel usage chalked on the side, and then you're checking the time to make sure you don't run out of gas. So this is yeah. So they started sticking hunting rifles and things in the fuselage. Now, the fuselage is a really loose term because those first planes, I can't remember the name of the plane before the. Come on, you were supposed to just spit it out at that point. There was a plane that was before the Sopwith Camel, and it was a biplane canvas, and you sat in an open cockpit. You wore the goggles, and you just sat out in the open, and you kind of like, oh, there's a German plane. I'm going to get my rifle up over here and just kind of steer with my leg. Like, this is just ridiculous. And just to that point, too, the additional, thanks to the Red Baron and his successful line of frozen pizzas and Snoopy, we romanticize the air wing of the First World War. This very dashing, everyone's got the scarf and the leather hat and the goggles. The scarf does serve a purpose because you would actually, your wool uniform would chafe the hell out of your neck because you're always looking for other planes. So you put a silk scarf on so you don't rip up your neck. But anyway, you get up in this plane and you've lived from taking off. Number one, we did that much. We're up in the air. When the airplane started getting big enough and heavy enough that they could actually, powerful enough, they could crest 10,000 feet, the engine would lock up. And you'd plummet to the earth and explode. This is a bummer. So they said, well, what are we going to do here? You remember, the internal combustion engine is new. So we're trying to figure out what formula of oil do we need? Something's happening. We're getting up too high and it's freezing. Started adding castor oil to the engine oil, which is where we get Castrol, which is still out today. I don't believe it still has castor oil in it, but it's the same company. They started adding castor oil. Castor oil, if anyone's ever taken it, is an industrial laxative. The fascist government under Mussolini in Italy in the 30s used to torture people by giving them castor oil. The exhaust pipe on the engines were right here. So you're flying, and we're running castor oil through the engine, and I'm breathing the fumes as we're going. Now I have a problem, and I'm at 11,000 feet, and it's about 20 below zero because I'm at 11,000 feet. Soldiers had two options, and one of them was to hang over the side of the plane and hope for the best. So again, this isn't as romantic when you start to like lay out the facts. Yeah, air combat. There's a fabulous book. I can't remember the author, but it's Marked for Death is the name of the book, and it just Marked for Death, and it just details the growth of the air wing and just this grotesque Monty Pythonian response to, we didn't know how cold it was up there. We didn't know the castor oil was going to make you go to the bathroom. We didn't know. We found out the hard way. Again, the uniforms were also not pressurized. We didn't get pressurized air suits until the Second World War. So you're breathing very thin air and very cold air, and you have to go to the bathroom really bad. And you're also trying to fly a plane and kill other people while they're also actively trying to kill you. I wouldn't volunteer for the air wing. It's not me. I'm too big anyway. They wanted much smaller people. I guess infantry would be the way to go for me. I'm not getting in a plane. But yeah, I know. Submarine service doesn't sound good, and tank service doesn't sound good. You know, I have a photo in my office, and I didn't bring it because it's not an original. I didn't want to bring a reprint. The tanks of the First World War had to coordinate because one lone tank zooming along at a blistering 5 miles per hour by himself is not that effective of a weapon. We need them to all move together. Well, a tank is extremely loud. It is now, and it certainly was then. So the idea of a guy opening the window in the tank and blowing a trumpet out to try to coordinate tanks wasn't happening. They're like, what are we going to do? We need to send messages from tanks to tanks. What are we going to do? Or send messages back to the infantry saying, we got this far, send more help. So the Mark II British tank had a little door on the right spontian that would open, and you would release a pigeon, a messenger pigeon out the side of the tank to fly back to the lines to let them know how far we got. Tell me that's not a Monty Python bit, that I'm not remembering the whole thing. We've got a 25-ton iron beast with guns sticking out of it, and it's full of people inside of it, and then it stops, and you can hear the little squeaking from Monty Python as the door opens, and a pigeon comes out. The war gives us so many of these examples of just like, are you kidding? Is that what we're doing now? No questions from this end. You nothing? You got the look.
Well, I guess
I'm going to put you on the spot to give me a question.
Do you think that the regression in use of things like Cubs and Pigeon was because the technology could not advance as fast as we could regress to what we already knew?
That's a really fabulous question. I think that it's human nature to go to what's comfortable. You know, we all do it when we're faced with adversity. We rely upon what we know. That's trying to add a great deal of groupthink to this operation. We're talking millions and millions of people. Suddenly, all of the things came together in the First World War. The ability to make steel strong, to make engines strong, to make oil last up at heights and things, where none of these things had a use yet. And they all kind of came together, and it was like taking the lid off a box of nightmares. Like anything you could think of, we're going to try to build it, hence the space gun and stuff. But then it was like, now what? You know?
We got this far.
Yeah, well, what do we do? Like the example, there's no anti-aircraft guns, but we're trying to mount flamethrowers on a plane to burn people up on the ground, but there's nobody to shoot back. Like we're missing the tit for tat that would have probably prolonged the war, because we would have kept like coming out with answers to these. But yeah, I think that this just was born out of frustration and disappointment. The individual infantrymen, the British experience was that you were rotated. So you were in the front trench for 5 days, and then you'd be sent to one back, and then rest if you lived. But you were in the front trench, you didn't sleep for 5 days, because all night they would just fire flares and machine guns. And the Germans are real fond of taking Maxim machine guns and putting them at a high angle and just firing them from like a mile away, knowing that the arc of the bullets would bring them down onto the line, so that everyone had to stay in the mud like the whole time you were in the front trench. So from that was certainly born a lot of frustration. You know, I'm going to make a bomb out of my lunch tin kind of attitude. And you probably feel really helpless as an infantryman in this conflict. You probably feel like, why am I even here? What am I going to do? I've got this rifle, and it holds 5 rounds, and I've got my hat, but I can't even stick my finger up over the trench, or I'll have my whole arm blown off. So you start getting frustrated and angry, and you start putting nails in table legs and stuff, and say, if I get my hands on a German soldier, swear me God, I'm going to smash his head in with this. I just have to cross, this barbed wired, pockmarked death pit that's full of these fireworks that never went off, and skeletons and stuff too. If I get over there, I'm hitting somebody with this. But that's a really good question. Are you holding a weapon? Oh no, you're holding a table. I thought, what happened?
No.
Okay.
It's just a piece of wood,
No, it's beautiful.
but it's a fairly thick piece of wood, and I was wondering if we could get a demonstration of the death darts.
Oh, well, if we were lucky, we can get one to stick.
You'll just stand and-
Yeah, you stand. Let me get a beer. And the World War I edition of Hold My Beer. I'm for fairness, I'm probably going to stand on a chair too, because I want to give it a little bit of a drop. And this is now, I haven't been drinking, folks, so if I fall, it's just because I'm naturally uncoordinated. We're going to give it 4 tries. One of them is really rusty, so I bet you that's not going to be the one. See if any of these stick. No. But you notice it's
It's dented.
yeah. I missed that. Throwing it is harder than dropping it. Here, you try. You're taller than me.
Do you have any balls of wood?
Yeah, right. Do you have any French heads? They were really effective against French.
These are terrifying up close.
No, these are awful up close. The one with the
like the little crosshatch for. What would normally be like fletching for an arrow.
Yeah.
But this is essentially just a bullet with metal fins on it.
And we have the curlicue version here too to try to impart a spin. Yeah. All right, let's see. You're good at cutting people. Oh, wait, that's upside down. Yeah, I mean, really, neither one of us are traveling 100 miles per hour.
No, I mean
That didn't even land straight.
Maybe
All right.
8 to 10 feet.
Yeah.
And it's even.
No, it's just 1 ounce of steel.
And this is just regular pine, and it's
So they are weighted. These are heavy on the
Well, they're heavy on the end that they hope that goes to the end. Probably, if I had to guess, when these were ejected from the picnic basket of doom, probably the first moment or so of flight, they were just a jumbly mess.
Yeah.
But velocity would take over, and then we'd start to get that drill effect. Yeah, the heavy end. So if that tabletop was a French person's head, they would probably be okay. But we were definitely flying pretty low for this attack. Yeah, if I am a stationary device going from 3 feet from the ground. But thank you, Tyler. That was a bit of fun. What do you want to see? If you want to hold it, I'll attack it with this. Let's see if this gets chop. No? All right. Yeah, well, you wear a helmet. Yeah, you put a helmet on, and let me just cuckoo this. That's a terrible idea. Yeah. The safety representatives in the back row said no. Thank you. That's my wife. That's what happens. You have the intelligent voice from the back row that says, "Honey, I let you bring all this stuff out of your office, but you're not hitting your barber with a sword." Not today, my friends. If there are no other further questions, there's a further question.
What's the connection with the donuts?
Thank you. Donuts not only are delicious, but prior to the First World War, donuts were considered a delicacy that people didn't really eat. They were almost like the beignet kind of design prior to the First World War. They weren't the donut hole that we see and know today. But when the YMCA and the Red Cross started opening up forward operational bases on the Western Front to give aid to soldiers, they handed out cigarettes and donuts because they figured out a way to mass produce this fried dough with a tube. That's why it has a hole in the middle. And they would fry these donuts up and distribute them in baskets, not unlike the death basket. But the soldiers became hooked on these donuts. They were the one thing they looked forward to going back behind the lines was a pack of cigarettes and some donuts. And so for many years after the First World War, the YMCA used to actually hand out donuts as a symbolism of the First World War. And so, what's that? And the YMCA has never handed out beer. At least not one I've been to. Why do we have beer? Because it makes this better. I made a lot more sense to all of you if you've been drinking. Yeah, right. I'm going to have one in a minute. I'm parched. No, beer actually symbolizes to me, in this all jokes aside, something that adds an element of crazy to all of this already crazy that we're looking at, is that soldiers were still issued alcohol daily as part of their rations. Sometimes a quart of alcohol per day. A bottle of Pinard wine was standard daily ration for the French lunch. You had a tin of meat, some bread, and a bottle of wine. So everybody was pretty soused by mid-war. Yeah, hey, you know what, guys? Just hear me out. Hear me out. I've been drinking, and I got this table leg, and I got some nails, and I'm gonna sneak out and hit the Germans with it. Yeah, there's a little bit of that going on. I mean, honestly, British naval rum, Navy, that was 150 proof in the First World War, and they were issued 8 ounces of it a day. Oh, I mean, if you drink 8 ounces of 151, you'll do anything, or nothing, depending on how that hits, Alcohol was a massive part of the First World War. It was issued to everyone. It was issued for bravery. It was issued for survival. It was issued for breakfast. And no matter what, they were giving out alcohol. And so that was kind of the reason why, Tyler and I talked at the beginning of this. He's like, well, what do you want to do? So we can't have a pizza party. Well, donuts, we could, but it was like, well, donuts and beer, yeah. So, because beer makes everything better, and also because it symbolizes, thank you, the combat, the First World War. All right, well, yes, very local, from across the street. You can't really get more local than that. I guess this will officially draw to a close my presentation. I want to, before proceeding, make sure to thank Tyler and Natalie, who have put a tremendous amount of work into making tonight happen. We're standing in their barber shop after they've worked all day. They don't want to normally be here this late. They put a ton of effort into the social media aspect of it and arranging all of this. So thank you. If it wasn't for the two of you, we wouldn't be here. Hi, good people of the internet. I hope you enjoyed too. This is a fabulous barbershop, and I recommend you come here and get your hair cut or beard trimmed.
There's usually less swords.
There's generally speaking less swords, but there are still always swords. Also, too, as I mentioned at the beginning, I am the author of a historical fiction novel, P is for Pickelhaube. If you enjoyed the chaos that's been tumbling out of my mouth for the last hour and a half, I have signed copies available for sale tonight, and my crew can assist in that if anyone is interested. But with that, I'm getting myself a beer. Thank you. I'll take the pale. Which one do you like better? Give me the pale ale. Yeah, I want the pale ale.
Thank you, Ryan. That was really good.
Hey, you're welcome. Did this even work?